these recent events have brought to the fore many of the recommendations that we've supported for years, and some of them are newer ones based on technology, but they are all with the aim of ensuring that there is accountability within law enforcement for upholding constitutional rights, particularly when there seems to be evidence of racial bias. So the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund recently sent a letter to the Department of Justice asking that it take specific measures, and we articulated 4 different measures that we think will make a significant difference. First off is certainly to conduct a comprehensive review of all police-involved assaults and killings. The recent killings of, at this point, 4 different African-American males in the course of a little over a month have brought these instances to the fore, but as we all know, these are not, unfortunately, new events. That we've seen this most predominantly most noticeably when we saw the Rodney King beating many years ago, and there have been far too many deaths, assaults, and beatings in the interim. With that in mind, we are asking the Department of Justice to undertake a very comprehensive and thorough review of the assaults and killings of all unarmed individuals, with a particular focus on the killings of unarmed African Americans. Secondly, we're asking that the Department of Justice use its funds, use its grant process to incentivize local law enforcement to engage in stronger training around the issue of racial bias. And we don't mean just express bias and prejudice, but also implicit bias, subconscious racism that plays a significant factor into how police view these communities and the ways in which they interact with African American and other communities of color. We also want to make sure that the grant process funding is tied to the use of force and to incentivize police departments to use force only in instances when it's necessary and not to abuse the power of its force, and certainly not in these instances where it arises in the murder of unarmed individuals. Third, we are asking that the Department of Justice hold police officers accountable to the fullest extent of the law, to the extent that any police officer has abrogated his or her duties as a public servant, to the extent that any police officer has exhibited racial bias, explicit or implicit, to the extent that any law enforcement officer has used excessive force against an unarmed individual, they should be investigated and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And we're asking that the Department of Justice keep that in mind in thinking about whether there are any federal civil rights charges to be brought or federal criminal charges to be brought in addition to any that may be brought on the state and local levels. And finally, in terms of new technology, one of the real game changers in the recent events that we've seen is the fact that there has been a recording of these incidents, that we can actually see, as painful as it is to watch, the death and assault on Eric Garner, for example, that we have video of Miss Marlene Pinnock out of California who was brutally beaten by California Highway Patrol. And that has made a significant difference in capturing the evidence that's needed to hold these law enforcement departments accountable. So we are also asking the Department of Justice to encourage the use of police officer body-worn cameras. We think that having additional technology in play will allow for the gathering of evidence that can help substantiate claims of bias, of excessive use of force, and hopefully prevent the use of force because law enforcement officers will be more mindful of their actions before they become deadly.
You're calling for a review of all police killings of unarmed individuals. Is that kind of an automatic trigger? And would the Justice Department be capable of such a larger role? There are a whole lot of such incidents in the United States.
Well, they certainly are capable of this kind of role, and I think when you have a concentrated number of such killings, particularly against a discrete minority group, it calls for such a comprehensive review. The potential and already mounting distrust of law enforcement in many communities of color is something that ought to be of concern not only to the Department of Justice but to the American public as a general matter. It is important that we maintain a relationship of trust with law enforcement, and to the extent that that is being eroded by these tragic killings, the Department of Justice ought to step in and ensure that the public trust is well-founded and that there's no malfeasance on the part of law enforcement, and particularly if there is the exercise of racial bias.
But this would require a significant beefing up of Justice Department manpower.
Well, we're not asking that the Department of Justice engage in foot patrol. What we're asking is that the Department of Justice review these instances where unarmed individuals have been killed. I don't think that's too much of an undertaking to consider, particularly when we are asking that in the first instance it consider those killings that have an air of potential racial bias. As we know, this recent spate of killings of African American males, and there again have been others that have involved African American women as well, ought to be investigated. They are at this point far too prevalent. There's a significant amount of evidence demonstrating that there are concerns of over-policing in these communities, of broken windows policing, of racial profiling that has led to this disparate number of killings among African Americans. And of course, we are concerned about any unarmed individual being killed by officers if it isn't justified.
Civil rights prosecutions against cops have a rather thin historical record of success.
And we hope to change that. That's true, and that is why one of the remedies that we're asking for is to be able to hold law enforcement to their accountability to the fullest extent of the law. Police officers are an invaluable feature of our society, and they are here to serve and protect, but they are also, like any other citizen of this country, bound by the laws of this country and are expected to uphold the civil and constitutional rights of all members of society.